You're there. You're just finishing your shift at the grocery store. Oh my gosh, what a long shift it's been. You've been stocking pallets, putting out pallets. It's just been the longest day, it feels like. But you're so excited to go home. Your birthday's in a couple of days, and the excitement is almost tangible in the air. Every time you come home, you can feel it like almost vibrating in the air how excited you are for your birthday. There's going to be cake and presents, and your mom has maybe let it slip that she got you the present that you've been waiting for like your entire life. And it's only a couple days away. You just have to make it through today's shift. You're closing up. It's 9:30 at night. The only thing left to do is go get the shopping carts from outside. You slough on your coat and you get ready to go outside. Your manager comes over and he says, "Hurry up, man. I want to go home early today." You're like, "Say less." That's what I've been waiting to hear all freaking day. So you run outside and, like a video game, you immediately target these shopping carts. Of course, these people don't put them in the correct corrals, so you have to go around the parking lot trying to gather them up. But you notice instead of there being like an empty parking lot, there's this kind of van that's parked crooked in the parking lot. You're pushing around your shopping carts, whatever. Some jerk left his car parked really weird. But that's when the lights turn on. You clutch the shopping carts maybe a little bit tighter. Okay, well, um, I guess he's just gonna drive off now. But he doesn't. Instead, the car goes directly towards you. Like, okay, I better just scooch out of the way. You push the shopping carts a little bit faster. But that's when the van pulls up next to you. And you don't even get to look inside. The only thing you're looking at is the barrel of someone's handgun, and it's pointed directly at you. You're shaking, and this isn't like normal at all. You've never seen a gun in your entire life. You're terrified, stunned, literally a deer in his headlights. That's when he tells you to get in. You don't even think about anything else. You hop in the van, no questions asked. Yeah, whatever you say. The door doesn't even get to close behind you before the van takes off. And that's when you take in your surroundings. There's no handles on the door, but instead of handles, there's knives and pliers and wire coat hangers hanging all over the wall of the van. This was the van of the Freeway Killer, a serial killer that tortured and killed 21 victims. Hi, and welcome to the Decomposing Flower podcast. We're excited to have you with us as we delve into some truly intriguing and occasionally disturbing true crime cases. I'm your host, Kira, and with me is Jen. Everything we say in our podcasts are information we've gathered from testimonies, interviews, documents, and trusted sources. Any opinion we say is our own opinion. If we get any information wrong, please feel free to let us know in the comments. We mean no disrespect to any of the victims or anyone affected by this case. Today, we're going to be discussing the freeway murderer. Before we get started, I need to give some heavy trigger warnings for today. We will be talking about murder of children, assault of children, horrible acts committed to people, manslaughter, mutilation of bodies. So if any of that is upsetting or you feel unsafe to listen to, it's okay to skip this one. You can check out any of our other podcasts or, take a break, watch a happy movie, and take care of yourself. I'm going to get into William Bowen, who was interesting to say the least. He was the second of three sons, but he came from a really, really troubled home. And this doesn't excuse anything that, happens in the case. but both his parents were alcoholics. And his father served in World War II and clearly had a lot of trauma from that event. But due to the way things were, perhaps back then in the 1940s, there wasn't a lot of support for men who were recovering from anything of the war. But his father abused his mom and uh, his brothers and himself. But once again, that doesn't excuse anything of what they do. It's just that's what happened. His mother also suffered from severe mood swings, but both of them also had a gambling problem. His mom frequented a bingo parlor, and his dad actually gambled away their home. So they ended up having to go live with their grandparents. So, despite all of this, Bowen and his brothers were raised Catholic. But despite all this, the staff repeatedly made complaints about Bowen's behavior towards other students. He actually rode his bike into a group of girls. Due to this, he was placed into juvenile hall to correct his behavior, hopefully. Him and his older brother, Robert Jr., once he got out of the hall, were placed into a Catholic covenant. The covenant enforced really harsh discipline, with extreme assault being commonplace. The nuns forced him to punch a fence when he misbehaved. We might get into the school a little bit more, but there were a lot of things that allegedly the staff did, like push people downstairs or force them to eat gross things. There
Oh,
was just a lot I found when I was researching the case about this school. But later on in his life, doctors went over Bowen's body and found that he had some brain damage, actually, which was thought to restrain violent impulses.
oh, interesting.
Yeah, it caused manic depressive illness, and there were a lot of unexplained scars on his head and the backside of his body.
Wow.
In this school, he was actually pretty severely bullied, and no one really stood up to him for him, not even his brother, allegedly. But according to some sources, he was actually defended by another kind of orphan boy who was at this school. And according to Bowen, the individual escorted him into the restroom and began to touch him.
Oh,
Yeah. And Bowen's request actually was that he had his hands tied with a towel, and then he was bound and essayed. At
oh,
the time, he was 8. So a lot of doctors, after kind of cross analyzing him, believe that he was actually a victim of assault before this happened. It's horrifying, but later on, this will come back in the case that he asked to be tied up. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. But throughout his life, he had this deep kind of shame, and he wouldn't tell a lot of people about it, um, unless you were part of his inner circle. He had an attraction to young children and male teachers. He was particularly horrified at his attraction to males. Later on, neighbors recalled that he spent a lot of his time alone, and he was mostly unkept and hungry. Neighbors remember giving them food out of kind of sympathy, as his parents really weren't around. And this is where it gets really kind of gross because they were left at their grandparents, right?
yeah.
Um, his maternal grandfather, Bowen's mother, came out and said this, was actually a known child molester
Oh my God.
who had abused her, essayed her, and even tried to attempt again after she was married.
Wow.
Not only that, but Robert Jr., his brother, who oftentimes received the worst of their father's abuse, oftentimes beat and belittled his siblings as well, to try to cope with the trauma. But once again, that doesn't excuse him of his actions. It's just something that happened. So, because Bowen really wasn't having any kind of parental supervision or there was no consequences for him, he stole a lot of random kind of knickknacks. Like he stole hubcaps and license plates and random like metal tags allegedly around kind of town. And he was actually placed in a juvenile detention center because of this and other petty crimes. While incarcerated, allegedly, he was also essayed by an adult counselor who was in the detention center. So there's just a lot of unfortunate acts that were done to him as a child. And because of this, he learned very early on what sexuality felt like. So he didn't really
Wow.
have that kind of childhood innocence. Um, but he
Like, he was
also
exposed
took,
to it really early?
sorry, what's that?
He was, like, exposed to it really early?
Yeah, super early, like earlier than 8,
That's
probably.
cool.
But because of this, he also thought that maybe these actions were okay as he did it to others. He actually fondled his younger brother, Paul. So, about 6 months after the incident, Paul informed his mom about what had happened, and he was forced to sleep in a separate bedroom. But later on, Bowen later confessed to molesting other young boys and exposing himself to a 10-year-old girl. And this is alleged, but when he was a teenager, he attempted to, and this was either SA or consensual, but he tried to do incestuous incestuous acts with his older female cousin. So to no one's surprise, he dropped out of high school. His mom kind of denies these facts, but a lot of neighbors came out and said that he essayed a lot of local neighbor children, and it really escalated his antisocial behavior as kind of no one in the neighborhood was like, oh, this is a good guy. So his mom was really worried about him and would oftentimes, ask him to be like, oh, you know what, just go get a girlfriend. Things will be okay if you just go get a girlfriend. Or why don't you go get a proper job? Why don't you go in the military? Like, it'll take care of you, right? But eventually, she was forced to evict him from their house. The reason why was never disclosed, but we can safely assume it was probably to do with his escalating behavior. But because of this, Bowen did end up joining the Air Force, and he also became engaged to a woman named Linda, all of which was largely determined because of his mom. Horrifyingly, Linda actually said later on that Bowen came to her and told her about his nightmares about SA and murder of a young woman. So take with that what you will.
Wait,
Um,
like, that he had committed?
uh, it
Or we
probably
don't.
it was you can't really make any assumptions from dreams, but he would have reoccurring nightmares about
Oh, okay, I
that
see, I
kind of
see.
thing. But in Vietnam, Bowen really kind of saw something he would never have seen in his hometown, which was violence and death and lots of SA. Vietnam was not a happy place. The war was awful, and some of the war crimes, and I'm in no position to really talk in depth about the subject. But yeah, some of the war crimes that were committed by soldiers in Vietnam and the horrors of that war was just awful. But they gave an unstable man the power to command life and death, which is so scary. And they actually encouraged that. right? So he logged over 700 hours manning a machine gun, and he's known to have risked his own life on more than one occasion to save fellow soldiers. It was because of this act that he received a medal, actually, and supposedly he received more than just this medal. But it wasn't discovered until much, much later that he actually essayed two other soldiers at gunpoint under his command.
Oh,
Yeah. So truly so horrifying for those who were affected by him that he got a medal for what he had done.
yeah.
And allegedly, later on, he said that he had consensual relations with four young girls, he said, and a number of encounters with men in Vietnam. So
Wow.
he only was in Vietnam for 3 years before he received an honorable discharge and returned home at the ripe young age of 21.
He was only
Yeah,
21 when all that crazy.
only 21 and he's done this already, right?
That's crazy.
Gets way worse though. So when he returned home, he was expecting to come home to his, fiance, his wife. There lots of different sources said a bunch of different things, and I never really knew if they were married or not.
Oh, okay.
Um, but he actually discovered that his wife, who had given birth to their son, had left him and married another man. So she was safe or away from him. So that's good. But soon after his return, he was actually convicted of essaying five young boys. In each case, his method was the same: cruise for young boys, pick them up, handcuff them, and essay them. He picked up a 14-year-old boy, which is so sad because he was just walking home when Bowen pulled up next to him and he offered to take him home. The boy actually attempted to flee, but Bowen kept asking him questions like, "Are you gay? What do you think about gay people?
Oh
Do
my god.
you like gay people? Have you ever thought about gay people?" And so he tried to run, like he tried to get the heck out of this car. And he thought he was going to be okay as he was driven to a nearby shopping center. But he was surprised when the cold slap of metal wrapped around his hands and he was being choked and essayed. Later on, he was actually dropped off at a park and he returned home, and his mother called the police right away. This happened a lot of times where he would just find a hitchhiker and ask them about, their sexuality, and he would ask them, what do you think about those gays, before he would park in a secluded area and essay them. But things quickly, and I mean quickly, escalated. First, he would choke them using his hands, and then he had procured a tire iron. Later on, this becomes one of his favorites to use, but he would repeatedly beat people with this tire iron, and he would threaten that he has friends who would finish off the job if they told on him.
Oh my god.
hmm Right before he was incarcerated, he found another hitchhiker, and oftentimes he would try to make it okay by offering them money. Many times, these young boys, they were so young, like 12-year-old, 18-year-old. They were so young, they didn't know what was going on.
Oh,
Um, and they would try their hardest to escape the vehicle. But he was actually kind of a bigger man, and he had done this lots and lots before. Things really escalated, and some of his victims even stated before he started becoming a serial killer that and this is what he said verbatim, according to one of his victims: "I'll rip off your nuts if you don't cool it."
oh my god.
Yeah. Later on, things do kind of take that kind of turn. But luckily, he was found right before he assaulted another 16-year-old who was running away from his troubled home life, when Bowen found him and cornered him in his own mother's vehicle. So
Wow.
he was sent to a medical facility where he was declared unsuitable for further treatment because he kept trying to assault other inmates.
Oh my god.
Yeah,
Oh,
two of
that's
which were had some mental challenges and didn't have the capacity to understand what was going on.
oh.
Yeah. And so 3 years later, he was released from prison after the doctors concluded he was no longer a danger to the health and safety of others. When just 3 years later, he was unsuitable for treatment. They were like, "We can't help this guy. He is
Holy shit.
unfixable." So he was a rapist and a pedophile, but not yet a killer. One of his last victims to survive, he was standing on the corner of the street and he had his thumb proudly up in the air. I need to catch a ride and I need to catch it quick. It was the last day of summer vacation and he would be a high school freshman tomorrow. He needed to go right away because this was his last day to enjoy the sun and fun with his friends. That was when a blue Cadillac pulled up next to him and said, "Where are you going?" This was Bowen, and he just offered a ride to a 14-year-old. And initially, he was really cool, his victim said. There wasn't anything kind of strange about him. Nothing screamed, "This man is going to traumatize me for the rest of my life." It got a little weird when he turned over and asked if he was gay. And, he was like, "Okay, I think this is my stop. I like to get out here now." Yeah, oops. Oh, I think you just missed the part where I was supposed to get out of the car here. And that's when he felt the barrel of the gun being
Oh,
poked into his side. That's when he knew he was in trouble. The city around him slowly turned into fields, and he thought he was going to die. Like he had just found the spot where he was going to get murdered. He was choked with his own t shirt. This was also really significant to the case, so try to keep that in mind, and essayed. But as he was screaming for his life, Owen actually released him and said, "Oops, I'm sorry. Choked you a little too hard there." And, his victim actually didn't say anything. He was so shocked that he actually apologized. He's like, "Oh, I'm going to live just like that." And so he drove him home, actually. And on the way back, Bowen turned to him and said, "You know what? You're an all right guy. I was going to kill you, but I want to come back and use you again."
oh my god. That's scary.
Yeah. And so he dropped him off at home and they immediately called the police. And 2 months later, Bowen was charged again and arrested. This time, though, one of the cops actually remembers this. And he thought, it was a sign that he was like, "Oh, you know what? I'm good. I'm changed. I'll never do it again." He was like, "You know what? There won't be a next time. It's gonna be okay." But maybe what he meant was next time there just won't be any witnesses.
Mm.
Mhm.
Like, why would they even, like, keep releasing him?
Yeah. Like, they
That's
locked him up twice.
like, at that point oh my god.
Yeah. So, he was sentenced to serve 1 to 15 years, but he was actually released from detention, and yeah, he only served less than a year, like 18 months, pretty much. Oh, sorry,
Dang.
less than a year. That's not 18 months. He was charged in December and he was released in October. And he only had 18 months with probation.
Wow.
And the neighbors around him really began to suspect something was wrong. Bowen tried to live in Hollywood for a little bit and kind of hang out with, the scene down there. He would go to the clubs. He was kind of disgusted with himself, but he would try to go to the gay clubs too. But things just weren't working out in Hollywood. So he moved back home, and the neighbors began to suspect something was really wrong. One of the guys who actually lived next on the street said his son came home and said that Bowen had tried to invite him inside, but he went home instead. And the neighbor just thinks he tried to go for my boy. A neighbor who lived just behind them remembers hearing screaming. And, like, you know, it's a neighborhood, there's kids. Sure, there's going to be screaming, but not at 3 a.m.
Yeah.
She wrote it off as neighborhood kids just playing around, goofing around, maybe telling like some horror stories to each other, and it just got out of hand. But it woke her up and she stayed awake. It was a blood curdling scream. And she still thinks about that to this day, what that could have been. 4 doors down from them, another neighbor remembers that he showed them all like some really raunchy movies. And he always had beer in his fridge for all the boys in town. He was very friendly with all the boys. So Bowen wasn't the only perpetrator in today's case. He was the perpetrator in every single one of the murders, don't get me wrong. But he was also helped by some of his friends and later lovers. And I just want to quickly mention them because I don't really separate who did who. In the eyes of the law, some of them were found guilty and dealt harsher sentence than the others. But I just want to talk about it before we kind of uh, get too deep into the case. So there was also another 21-year-old. His name was Vernon Butts, aptly named because he was an ass. But he also connected with Bowen really kind of deeply. He had a really hard home life as well. He was only 9 years old when his dad died. And since that day, he kind of drifted in and out of trouble and out of institutions and the law. Like he had a long criminal record. And most of this was for things like burglary and arson. But later on, it was speculated that he also had the same fascination with sadistic sexual activity. He claimed the reason why he helped Bowen so deeply was because he held some kind of hypnotic control over him. It was probably because of the drugs. That generally tends to help things. But yeah, in contrast, Bowen said that he held Butts in high, high regard because he could talk to people and he was just so smart and he was forthright and, you know, he just kind of did what he wanted to do and he really appreciated that. Both of them lived this kind of alternate lifestyle where they had, wives and girlfriends and but they both were lovers themselves.
So, like, kinda like a double life.
Yeah, yeah. Another man, his name is James Monroe, and Bowen was Monroe's boss and landlord, and he is still in prison to this day. I couldn't find too much about his backstory. Sadly, it was so saturated with the case details and everything. But he alleged that he was forced to participate in fear for his own life. But he's also made other statements saying that he was a willing accomplice and claimed that he was actually the murderer instead of Bowen. And in a radio interview, he actually found it kind of enjoyable what they went on to do. 18-year-old Gregory Miley, he was illiterate and really didn't have the highest IQ. He only had an IQ of 56, which is pretty low. Just like Bowen, he was a high school dropout and kind of floated around. His mom had a lot of dysfunctional marriages, we're going to describe them, and she also really kind of neglected him. Miley viewed Bowen as kind of a father figure almost, Like he's the dad I never had and he's doing all these cool things and he's just kind of a man's man and he's always so cool. So he spent a lot of time with him and eventually their relationship got pretty deep. He was also his lover.
Mhm.
And then finally, the most active accomplice was William Pooh. I'm gonna probably butcher that last name, but he was only charged for one murder. And I also didn't really find too much about his backstory. So those are the co perpetrators, the co accomplices in today's case. So it would go like this. Saturday night, we'd hang out with the wives, maybe just kind of take it easy, get all the groceries done, do the chores. And Sunday was for the boys. We're going to go cruise. I'll see you in a little bit, Bone would say as he grabbed his keys. They would jingle in his hand before he headed out the door. And they would climb into the van, the same van that, for some strange reason, didn't have any handles on the passenger side and the rear door. And for them, they knew exactly where to find the knives and the pliers and the tire iron. It was a little stinky in there because the carpet was a little, you know, blood-stained, and there were lots of other stains in there.
Makes sense.
And they would cruise the freeways for more victims.
That's so scary.
hmm So, one of his first victims was actually from Germany. He was 17 and he was so excited about seeing America, and he was trying all the new hamburgers. It was so crazy. Like, they didn't have this back in Germany. Like, the beach was so new and he absolutely loved it. But he was backpacking and he just wanted to see more of the world. He'd done this hundreds of times, if not thousands, it felt like. He'd stick his thumb up and someone would come by and give him a ride. Sometimes, they were pretty cool. And he would get to learn a bunch of, new English, and he would get to talk and learn about someone else. But on this day, he was picked out and he was stabbed 77 times.
Oh,
Yeah. There was a orange nylon cord wrapped around his head and a piece of ignition wire around his ankles. He was sodomized and essayed, and he didn't get to make it back to Germany.
oh,
Yeah. So horrifying. But earlier in Bowen's life, he had threatened that he would bite body parts off. It wouldn't be long after he had his first taste of murder that he made good on that. He would bite off genitalia.
oh,
Yeah, it was so horrifying. Like, some of the police who found some of the bodies described it like they had been attacked by an animal.
that's oh,
Yeah, they would be mutilated and hacked and slashed. And it was just horrifying because you would be driving down the freeway, just doing a road trip, and you'd see something on the side of the road. You're like, oh, you know what? I just needed to take a pee break anyways. Like, let's go check it out. And you thought, oh, this is a weird place to have a mannequin.
oh my god.
But as you got closer, you notice there's a lot of red around here. I don't think, and then that's when you'd see it, a
Oh,
naked body, a naked boy who was only 15. He was the first child of Donald and Mary. And after his parents divorced, he moved with his brother and sister to California with their mom. He, struggled for a long time. It was hard. He loved his dad and he wished things could just go the way they were. So, he might have caused a little bit of trouble. And he lived with his grandparents for a time, but he loved baseball. And Pete Rose was his all time favorite. He wanted to be him so bad. But, deep down in his heart, he just wanted to be with his mom and be with his family in their apartment in Hollywood. But he would never see his mom again or his
mm,
family. When he was picked up off the off ramp of the Ventura Freeway, he had been strangled and stabbed, essayed, hacked and slashed, and just god awful. That's when victims started turning up with kind of almost this signature wound. He was bicycling to go see a new movie. It was so exciting. He didn't get to do this every day. He was gonna go meet up with his friends, and he could already taste the popcorn in his mouth. He never made it, and 3 days later, he was found on the Ventura off ramp. His head had been bashed in with a tire iron. Just like the others, he had been sodomized and strangled. Every Friday and Saturday, he would be in the same spot without question. This was their hot spot. They loved to just spend time together. And he would hang out with his friends and just have a hoot and a holler at the West Hollywood hotspot called the Starwood. He was 15 years old and a student from the Bell Gardens High School and proud of it. You know, he went to the club just like they always do, and he got a little distracted. It's okay, he'll find his way home. But everyone started calling each other and being like, "Hey, have you seen Billy?" "No." "When did you see him last?" "Oh, Friday. He was just went to the washroom, and that's the last time I saw him." That was the last time anyone ever saw him, as he started to walk home from the club. A van picked them up and they drove a couple blocks away where they sodomized him. And after they were unable to properly essay him, according to them, they took $6 from him and tied his hands and feet together as they wrapped a shirt around his neck. Using a jack handle, they twisted and twisted and twisted this t shirt around his neck.
Oh.
They drove to an alley and just dumped his body and kept on driving down the beach, looking for other victims. It wouldn't be long until they found their youngest target yet. He was only 12 years old. And he was just kind of hanging out down over by the beach. It was vacation time. Like, he was here for some fun in the sun when a couple of boys approached him. And, you know, they were like, "Yeah, we're actually just on our way to Disneyland. Do you want to come with us?" Like, I know it's kind of crazy, but what's going to be even crazier is seeing Mickey Mouse and riding Splash Mountain. He was so jazzed. It's like, say less. And climbed in the van. They're like, "We got some weed. Do you want to smoke it?" "Sure." That's when Miley and Bowen held him down, beat him, and strangled him with his own shirt and crushed his neck
Oh.
before just taking the little amount that Tim had in his wallet before dumping him next to a dumpster. There was this one that was found near the juncture of the 120 and 306 freeway. Just like his other victims, he had been brutally assaulted. But this was something new the cops noticed. There were wounds next to his neck and his right ear, and these had been made by an ice pick. Steve enjoyed card games with his best friend. I mean, who wouldn't? 52 pickup can be so fun when you're just throwing it at your friend and they're picking it up. But no, they loved playing all sorts of games. Like, really, those cards were so worn out, but they had a way to tell who had which card. You know? It was like they were playing Go Fish with x ray vision. The card was slightly folded in the corner, or that one was ripped right there. Yeah, he had the 8 of clubs. He also had big dreams of becoming a jockey. For Halloween, he dressed up as peanut butter and jelly. And his favorite thing was to watch horror movies with his mom. He would be sitting down cross-legged, just eating Cocoa Puffs by the handful out of the box while his mom just sat there knitting. His mom remembers telling Steve, "Don't you ever hitchhike." Like, she'd seen stories, she'd read the newspaper. She knew what happens if you hitchhike. And one too many hitchhikers have had a really bad experience for him to ever go hitchhiking. She said, "Never, ever, ever will you hitchhike, you know?" And Steve said, "Yeah, you're right, Mom. Why would I ever let someone pick me up? I would never let a creep pick me up." He said if anyone ever got a hold of him, he would be the kung fu monster. Pow! Wham! That guy didn't stand a chance. His mom could only laugh at Steve. Uh, he couldn't fight his way out of a paper bag. He was so clumsy. His mom would never say it, but he was kind of a small kid. But, Steve had this one day where he was gonna be late for his driver's class, and it meant the world to him to be able to drive, Like the whole world opens up when you're able to drive. You would be able to see movies whenever. You would be able to go to the mall and see your friends. I mean, he wasn't about to say to his mom that he would skip school, but I mean, it made it a little bit easier. So he stuck out his thumb and a van picked him up. He was only 16, but his nude body was found in an alley the next day. He too had been beaten, sodomized, and strangled. Derek was getting shopping carts, said his manager. He's always been so reliable as a worker. He only went to go grab the shopping carts at 9 o'clock. Okay, it only takes like 5 minutes to get shopping carts. Where the heck is he? It was 15 minutes after 9. They locked the inside door to keep customers out just in case they were like, "Oh, I need my eggs." But he unlocked the door and peeked outside. Derek was nowhere to be found. It was empty, but there was a line of shopping carts just in the middle of the parking lot. They would find Derek the next morning in an industrial park near the Artisa freeway. It was horrifying what they found. On his body, they found that he was actually forced to ingest a chemical. It was called chloral hydrate, which left chemical burns on his mouth, chin, chest, and stomach. He also had a wound through his right ear, which caused a fatal wound to his spinal cord. It was
Mm.
caused by an ice pick. Under his fingernails, they found skin and blood. He fought back. He fought back so hard.
Hmm.
Bowen actually commented on this one. He said he just started fading out after we gave him, a little bit of something to drink. And he just kind of started whimpering. And I don't like some limp piece of meat. It's no fun when they don't let me know how it feels.
Oh my god.
I guess we gave him too much of the stuff, he said. Next time, I guess I wouldn't use as much. Whatever. So I got my rocks off, and the kid was no fun anymore. So I just strangled him. He had dreams, but they were shattered way too quickly. He was always go, go, go. It was crazy, actually. He was so smart. His mom said that at 4, he was already speaking like a 16-year-old would, with just as much sass as a 16-year-old. He was really good at writing too. He figured things out quickly. Like, he was going to be a politician, they swore. He was so smart. His brother said he was just ahead of his time. He had dimples when he smiled, and he smiled often because he was such a good conversationalist. Like, you would talk to him, And he'd be like, "Oh my God, 3 hours just went by?" No. In the first grade, he was actually asked to leave school after he snuck in to ring the big bell on the school. His mom remembers at 15, he forged a boarding pass to get onto a plane where he stowed away and went to San Francisco all by himself. Like, what? Who does that? He was picked up by a van and found the very next day. He was a hardworking boy. He worked 5 days a week. He had dreams to become a radio disc jockey. But in the early days of March, you know, Russ was feeling a little lazy. And maybe he was a little bit late that day. He was getting ready to catch the bus to go to a restaurant where he worked. But, he called his boss and he's like, man, I'm going to be a little bit late. I think I just missed the bus. I'm going to go catch it though. The next one's coming real soon. He had just had his birthday and he was in so high spirits because he just got like one of the best presents ever. And he didn't, have any issues with his family. Everything was going good. The police would just tell his mom, he's just a runaway. We don't know where he is. We're just gonna stop looking. But they wouldn't have to, you know, not look very long before they found Russ. Tommy was kind of this crazy kid. you know, um, he'd come over after we just had lunch, and what had happened was he was so crazy about skateboarding. Like, he loved it. He lived and breathed in. But Tommy came over and he had just been in art class. On his cast, on his broken arm, he painted a rainbow. You're crazy, Tommy. Like, aren't rainbows for girls? Him and his best friend just laughed. He was so hyper, Tommy. He was, kind of getting into trouble a little bit all the time. He was so loyal to his friends and he loved being in Boy Scouts. He was picked up by a van. I won't get into it because this one is particularly brutal and it was just awful. His family tried to have an open casket, but everyone who went to the funeral remembers just the horrible way that he passed away and all the scars that were all over him.
Oh,
They didn't do a really good job of trying to piece him back together.
that's awful.
Owen's youngest victim was 12, and his oldest victim was 19. Altogether, it's alleged, even though he confessed, it's alleged that he killed 21 people. He was convicted of 14. In the trial, he described how him and his accomplice, Monroe, murdered a 15-year-old. And the way he talked about them was as though he did nothing more than take out the trash. He said, both me and Jim would just beat him up before we kill him. You know, I remember he said he wouldn't tell anyone. He just let them go. And when we finally got around to killing him, we just put this shirt around his neck. I twisted it, and he was strangled. Whatever. One of the
Wow.
mothers of the victims traded letters Bowen for many months. He confessed to murdering her son. He was only 14. He was never convicted of the crime though. Not once did he mention the murder. She had to break it off, trying to, get him to acknowledge or say anything about what had happened. All he mentioned was him and his favorite TV shows. He never acknowledged that he did anything wrong. His victims were so much more than victims. They were boys with dreams and goals and ambitions. Bowen's last words before he was put to death was, I feel the death penalty is not the answer to the problems at hand. That I feel it sends the wrong message to the youth of the country. Young people act as they see other people acting instead of as people telling them to act. And I would suggest that when a person has the thought of doing anything serious against the law, that before they did, that they should go into a quiet place and think about it seriously.
What a
The
weird.
audacity. Yeah.
He's literally like, don't kill me.
Yeah. He was so
Pathetic.
self-absorbed and he really was just kind of soaked in self-pity.
Yeah.
His co-conspirators, Vernon Butts, who also confessed to taking part into the murders, was found strangled with a towel in his jail cell. A
Oh,
death eerily similar of many of his victims. He was found hanging from a towel rack in the one-man hospital room cell. Officers said that he did it to himself while in a kneeling position. There's a lot of, conspiracies about this, but that's what they say. James Monroe was convicted of second-degree murder for his role in the murder of Stephen Wells, even though he claims that he was forced into it. He tried to make parole and it was denied. His next parole is in 2029.
oh wow.
Mhm. Gregory Miley was sentenced to a life term of 25 years for the first-degree murder of Charles Miranda. He was informed that he would need to serve a minimum of 16 years and 8 months before he would be considered for parole. While incarcerated, he was frequently reprimanded for violating prison rules. He was later sentenced to a concurrent term of 25 years for the life and abduction of another victim. On May of 2016, he died of injuries that he had sustained when he was attacked by another inmate in the exercise yard. William Pooh, who was charged with one murder, although he confessed to killing two victims. He received 6 years for voluntary manslaughter in a plea bargain. He served less than 4 years of his sentence and was released from prison in 1985.
Wow.
So he's around today, uh,
That's scary.
apparently. Yeah. And before we close today's case, I just want to highlight on the victims of today's case. Marcus Grabs, a 17-year-old German tourist. Donald Hayden, 15. David Monrillo, 17. Charles Miranda, 15. James Macabre, 12. Ronald Gatling, 19. Harry Turner, 14. Stephen Wood, who's 16. Darren Kendrick, who is 19. Stephen Wells, who is 18. Dennis Fox, who is 17. Russell Rowe, who is 15. Robert Weisstreck, who is 16. Glenn Barker, who is 14. Lauren Sharp, who was 17. John Kilpatrick, who is 15. Mark Shelton, who was 17. John Doe, who was between the age of 15 and 20. Thomas Lundgren, who is 14. Sean King, who is 14. Bowen was not brought to trial for the murders of Mark Sheldon, Robert, John Kilpatrick, Michael McDonald, or John Doe because the police did not find sufficient evidence linking him to any of those crimes, despite him confessing to the murders.
Wow.
And that was the case of the Freeway Killer.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's a lot.
it was a lot. It's so horrifying, but it's so important to remember the victims and justice was served, although it was served incredibly late. So many victims could have been prevented had he just be kept behind bars. It's really a tragedy what happened and that it could have been so easily prevented. Many victims live with, guilt and nightmares and so much trauma from the horrible acts that this guy committed. And I hope that they're able to find peace. As always, let us know your thoughts about today's case. Remember to take care of yourself, and we'll see you in the next episode.